All right, everyone, welcome again to yet another session of Tech Tuesdays. Today's topic is especially exciting because we're talking about REST web services. Now, REST has become a very, very popular technology to integrate in the era of cloud applications. And even more exciting is this new data technology standard called JSON. With us today to talk about these topics is Prem Kumar Somkumar, who heads our entire Cloud Labs department. Prem's been with Informatica for well over 12 years, and he basically comes out with a lot of the new connectors that we use within our Informatica Cloud service. In our agenda today, we're going to briefly discuss the differences between REST and SOAP web services. So for those of you on the call today that were on a couple of months ago, there was a SOAP web services session that was run by Brian Plaster where we talked about using Informatica Cloud to connect to a SOAP web service. So we're just going to have a brief primer once again on the differences between REST and SOAP web services. Then we're going to go into a comparison of JSON and XML and list some popular use cases and differences between the two. After that, I'm going to hand the ball over to Prem. He's going to go into a demo of using REST web services as well as JSON. Then we're going to have a summary of what we learned today, a Q&A session, and then we'll talk a little bit about the next Tech Tuesday session. So if you look at the overall concept of web services, the message format can be either in a SOAP or a REST format. And XML can be used in either SOAP or REST, but it's very, very common for SOAP. As far as a transfer protocol, HTTP is the one that's used for web services because it's optimized for data. And JSON, the new data interchange format that I just talked about, is used only for REST web services. So now let's look at some of the comparisons and use cases between JSON and XML. So JSON is an extremely lightweight data interchange standard, whereas XML is quite verbose. And JSON, because of its nature, is used very, very commonly in any web clients that use JavaScript, whereas XML is better suited for applications such as Adobe Flash, Oracle ADF, Microsoft InfoPath, or even open source solutions such as NetBeans. If you want to use JSON, it deals very, very well with atomic values or lists of hashes of atomic values, whereas if you're using XML, it deals better with extremely complex and unstructured data. JSON is better for anything that is schema-less and entity-free, while XML is better suited for namespace and well-formed mixed content documents, which is why you see some of the applications listed above, such as Microsoft InfoPath and Adobe Flash, are better suited for XML. So now that we've finished the comparison of JSON versus XML, I want to pass the ball over to Prem Kumar Somkumar of our Cloud Labs team, and he's going to go over a demonstration of how you can use REST web services as well as how you can use a JSON payload.
All right, folks. So today's topic is REST, and here I would like to take a simple example of how REST can be configured in Informatica Cloud and how we can build tasks running using the REST connector. So let me start off with a simple example. Where I'll take a simple example of TurboTax. Okay, so here we have a sample where you can submit. Or I'm submitting a REST API call through the web browser. So here's a simple API call, and in this case, I'm using a JSON. So on the left-hand side of this question mark, I have this, access to the URL, and on the right-hand side of the question mark, I have this the parameters to access the system. So here's a simple example of a JSON-based web services, and so whatever you see on the screen, it's pretty complicated, but this is the data that is being returned by the REST-based web service. And in Informatica Cloud, it takes this data and then puts in the form of a CSV file or the form of a tables and columns format. Another example of the same thing is also also in XML, right now. So this is another API call to the same REST-based application, right? So these are two different forms, and JSON is the one that we see very often, and JSON is the one that we are seeing a lot nowadays. So that's more like a modern technology right now. And Informatica connector for REST supports both JSON and XML. So with this, let me go to Informatica Cloud and show you how to configure the REST connector. So as you know, you can always go to the administration tab, and you can go to connectors, and you can download the REST connector as you see here. So if you haven't downloaded it, you'll see a free trial over here, and you go ahead and download and start using that. So let me directly go to the REST connection. So here's a simple example that I've created for TurboTax, and so the first one is the name of the connection, as you all know, and I have chosen the REST connector from the connection type. And then, if you look at this, I was talking about the URL, something on the left-hand side of the a question mark, and the right-hand side of the question mark for the API call. That exactly is what is represented here as the base URL. So whatever is to the left of the question mark in the REST API call that you mention it here, and the parameters, you can mention it as part of the URL request parameter. Then REST also has got other kinds of parameters. So this is a perfect example. The TurboTax is a perfect example for URL based, but there are other types of input parameters where it can be form based or header based. So those are the options that you see. And the next set of options is about the type of REST. So there are a couple of types of REST. So basically, you're focusing on XML, JSON. So here in this case, I have chosen the JSON example. And the REST request type. This is how you move data in and out of REST. So this information will all be part of the API. So when you go to when you get a REST documentation, it will recommend what kind of types you need to use. So here you get, and we also have the different types of authentication forms. So in NoAuth, basic authentication, digest, or authentication, and custom authentication. So these are the different types of authentication we support. And in most of the customer sites, you have seen the custom authentication being followed. So if you have your own authentication, we do support that, and that is well documented in our user guide. And then around the documentation, you provide the user IDs and passwords and all other information. So that's what you see in the next set of parameters. So these are the parameters that support these different types of authentication. And then the response folder path. So this is another parameter that will be heavily used. So the response folder path. So for example, the Informatica Cloud get access the REST API, and then it will convert the data XML or JSON in the form of a CSV file, and it will provide to you in the form of rows and columns. On top of it, if you also want to get the raw data, Informatica also does provide it. So you just need to provide the path where the raw XML or the raw JSON file should go. And if you don't provide the path, the system would not write the raw data. So it's all up to you. And then we have the concept of input parameters, configuration file name. So here you just mentioned the file name, that you want to pass as an input. All right. So at the time of running an API, you might want to change parameters on the fly, or you might want to try with a different API input parameters. So that file you represent it over here, or you mentioned the name of the file over here, and I will show that to you in a bit. And once you enter all these parameters, and when you click OK, what the system does is it'll create. So in this case, I have mentioned the name of the file called as intuit.csv, and if you go to intuit.csv, it'll list down the it'll list down the parameters that you see here. All right, and you can change the parameters the way you want, or you can try with different input parameters, and that's exactly the reason why this file is in here. All right. And then let me go back. So this is all about connection, the connection parameters. Okay, how do you contact the REST API? So it's all about the URL parameters, the authentication, and the mechanism, and the input parameters that you want to mention here. So this is the first step of getting connected to the REST-based application. And the next step is creating the DSS task for the REST. So in this case, I've already created one. I'll just take that right now and briefly walk you through the process. So I'm creating a DSS task that talks to this API, talks to this REST API, and gets the data for you and put it in a flat file. That's the sample that I'm going to show here. So here you choose the REST API, the REST connector that I just created. I'll just view that once again, So it shows those parameters that we chose. And then once you click the connection, it will show the list of objects that the REST API consists of. So here are the list of objects that you see, and you choose one of them. In this case, I've chosen the JSON root. It means I'm going to pick all the data from the REST-based system. This is the first step. And the next one is I'm choosing a target, and in this case, I have chosen I just want to pull the data, whatever data you see here. I want to pull the data into a flat file. All right, and the next step is the filters. So in the case of REST, you need to provide filters. I mean, basically filters are the input parameters that you need to provide. So either you can provide the input parameters, like you can mention what is the API version, what's the passkey, what's the include. You can mention them individually, or you can just mention the name of the file path. So that's what you see here: input parameters configuration file path. You can mention the name of the file where your input parameters are being stored. So the file that I just showed you right now, this contains the input parameters. So you can mention the name of the file and tell the system, hey, pick all the input parameters from that particular file and keep calling the REST API. So if I provide multiple values to it, it will keep calling the API that many times. All right. So yes, it will keep calling the API. And then next on to the field mapping. So basically, you're mapping the data that is coming out of the REST-based system into any target application you want to. So in our case, the target application is is a file, is a flat file. All right. So I mentioned if you want to make any changes to this, you can as well make it. All right. So basically, what's happening is that we look at the REST-based API, we look at the JSON file, and then we understand what is there in the JSON, and we convert that into rows and columns. Basically, we flatten them out and then display the flattened form over here. Right. So it's as simple as that. Basically, you're setting up connection and then setting up the input parameters and then letting it run. So the next step is I would just let it run. It'll take a minute or so. So let me close the screen. So this should take much time. This should be done pretty soon. All right. So I was able to pull one data out of the system. I can just show that right now. So if you look at the target file, this was created just now 9:17 p.m. my time, and you can look at the data over here. Right? So this is the data that is being generated. Okay, so you can see that the data that's in the form of an XML or the data that's in the form of a JSON has been converted into a row, columns and rows. So that's what you see here. And also on top of that, because they mentioned, hey, load this data into load the raw data into this response folder. You can also see that I have this response folder where the system has copied the raw JSON file. So, for example, if you want to take the raw data or the raw data from the REST system, and if you want to pass it to some other system, you can also do that by making use of this. And let me convert this into a format. So basically, what it's done is that it has taken the JSON file, and it has also downloaded the JSON file as well. So this is a perfect example, or a simple example of a REST. And likewise, if you also have, so the system can also take payload. So if the payload is in the form of an XML or the payload is in the form of a JSON, you can also mention where the payload is, and the system can take the data from the payload and apply it onto the REST system. So it's pretty much exhaustive. We have it running in a number of customer sites and going pretty good. That's about it, Ashwin. You want to take it from here?
Excellent. So what we saw right now was Prem Kumar Somkumar running a demonstration of using REST web services and using JSON as a payload. So let's go into some of the summary of our learnings today. So before you try out the REST web services connector, make sure that you have the correct authentication. You can even use your browser to test it out. And earlier on, we talked about the differences between XML and JSON and some of the comparisons of the use cases. So whenever you're given a choice between using XML as a payload or JSON, definitely use JSON. If you want to manually control the metadata, then within the configuration, fill in the sample response or XML or JSON file field in the connection parameter. And finally, download the raw response data from the REST web service into a separate folder. So those are the 4 things to keep in mind when you're testing out the Informatica Cloud REST web services connector. And if you have any questions, please type it in the chat box and we'll get to it shortly. So now let's go into some of the questions. And Prem, one question here that I have is about the type of authentication. So I know you touched upon this briefly, but can you elaborate on the kinds of authentication that you can use when utilizing the REST web services connector?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, we support 4 or 5 types of authentication. The first one is NoAuth. By default, so that is a very preliminary one, the no authentication, because the authentication is sent via the input parameters. And the second one is the basic authentication. The third one is digest authentication. The fourth one is O authentication, OAuth. That is being pretty much used by the modern systems, like especially the social media applications. And finally, we also do support the custom authentication. So this we are seeing a number of customer sites. So customers, they have their own authentication, and we do support that as well.
So Prem, there's actually a follow-up question on that, on the last part. about custom authentication. If you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely, Ashwin. So custom authentication, that's the fifth, and the latest authentication that we added recently. So basically, we see customers, they have different authentication mechanism for their own REST service, which usually do not confirm, out of the box authentication like no auth or no authentication or basic or digest authentication. So that is this is slightly different. So customers or vendors, they want to have their own way of authentication. So what we've done is that we have come up with this option called as custom authentication, and users, they can build their own solution and then plug it into Informatica Cloud, and they can just go ahead and make use of this custom authentication. So they are free to write their own plugin. So ultimately, they are free to write their own plugin and plug it into Informatica Cloud, and they can move forward.
Excellent. The other question that I have here is, so one of our attendees wants to know how you can integrate multiple REST web service requests from different systems. So in the demo, you obviously showed how you can connect to a single REST web service, but suppose you had a bunch of different REST web services requests from multiple different systems. How can you use the Informatica Cloud application to combine those different requests?
Yeah, really good question, Ashwin. So basically, we have this concept of dynamic URL. So dynamic URL is, for example, if the first web service, were one of the parameters page equal to 1. So this is very normal also, right? Now you mentioned page equal to 1, then page equal to 2, page equal to 3, and so on. So basically, they belong to this class of dynamic authentication. So we have it as a checkbox in our REST connector. So it's part of the connection configuration parameter. So the user can check it, and then they can mention. So in the configuration file, they can mention, what are the parameters involved for this dynamic URL, and the system will automatically pull one after another.
Okay, so that's how that particular integration scenario is solved. And the last question we have for today is a question around some of the payloads. So with our REST web service, what are all the different kinds of payloads that we can support? And I guess what are the ideal scenarios of payloads to use? I know we went over this, I think, in the Tech Tuesday Tips for Success section as well, but if you could just state the kinds of payloads and any best practices on when to use each type of payload.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Payload is another classic example, right? Now, payload is being used in REST. It's just not parameters, but we can also mention the payload. So usually there are two types of payload. One is the payload in the form of an XML, and the other one is the payload in the form of JSON. So as part of the REST connection or the API parameter, payload is one option where the user can mention what is the location of the payload. So once you mention the location where the payload is situated, and you drop the file or you drop the payload file onto that location, Informatica Cloud can pick up the payload from that system, and it can send it to it can send it to the REST as a payload. So.
Excellent. Okay, great. Thank you very much for that, Prem. I'm just going to wrap up with some of our next steps. So for those of you that had some of the more in-depth questions on our REST Web Services connector, please go to this particular Informatica Cloud Community's URL, and all our documentation, the REST Web Services connector, is posted over there. Once you've done with that, go ahead and download the generic REST Web Services connector from the marketplace. So once you go into the marketplace and you deploy it into Informatica Cloud org, you can start using it right away. And our next Tech Tuesday session is on October 15th, and it talks about Hadoop and cloud integration. So between now and then, apart from trying out the REST Web Services connector, here are some of the other applications that have been built using the Informatica Cloud REST Web Services connector. For instance, Talus Labs, Leads 360, Bazaar Voice, Mongo even, RiskMeter, and Salsar, just a few of them. So let's say you actually need to connect to any one of these applications because you're using it within your company. Instead of building a REST Web Services from scratch, you can actually use some of these connectors that we built using our Informatica Cloud REST Web Services connector. So you can find these listings also in Informatica Marketplace. Or if you wish, you can build your own one from scratch. That's all we have for today's session of Tech Tuesdays. Our next session is going to be a very, very exciting topic, and we're going to talk about Cloudera Hadoop. So we're going to talk about connecting to Cloudera via Hadoop as well as Impala. Thanks for joining, and see you next week.